Welcome to Train Signal. I'm Mel Haynes and you're watching SQL Server 2008, and in this video we'll be looking at data compression. Awesome new feature for SQL Server 2008. We're going to be looking at, first of all, two different types of data compression, starting with row compression as well as page compression. And then we'll also look at compressing your backups and talk about how that works. Now, if you're not familiar with doing SQL Server backups, you'll want to jump over there and look at my video on doing backups, because we don't review doing backups so much here, but just how to compress the data. But looking at row compression, if you're storing data in a fixed length data format, you're basically wasting a lot of space. So in this case, I've got a few text fields, right? And only Santiago is the one taking up all the space. The rest of them are leaving a lot of it unused. But if you go with row level compression, SQL Server moves you from a fixed length to a variable length. So now, all that extra allocated space you saw over there, it's not allocated. It's available. So you're not wasting that storage. So row compression is about moving from a fixed length data format to a variable length format so that you're only using the space you need for the data. And it's dynamic, so that's going to change based on the information you have in your data environment. When you look at page compression, however, page compression is more focused on minimizing data redundancy. What do I mean by that? Well, let's say you're the IRS, for example, dealing with the Internal Revenue Service here in the U.S., and every single American who's paying taxes is listed in there somewhere, and in that population there's probably quite a few people with the same first name, such as maybe John, right? So you've got the first name John, J-O-H-N, and then there's the other spellings, right? J-O-N for Jonathan, right? You've got that repeated quite a few times, quite a few million times perhaps, in your environment. So you really don't need to have those four characters, or let's say it's a longer name, you don't need to have those characters repeated over and over and over and over again in every record. You could have that text referenced somewhere once and refer to it. That's what page compression is all about. It actually takes that redundant information, removes it, and instead points you to it. Here, let me take you over to the Microsoft website on page compression implementation, and they have a little diagram that actually helps to explain that. So here, going to msdn.microsoft.com, I already kind of just typed that in there and it added its extra stuff to the end, but just type in the msdn.microsoft.com, takes you to the MSDN homepage, right? And from here, I'm going to go to page compression. Implementation. If I type that right, it takes me to summary. And I'm going to scroll down to a diagram on that page. If this is your data, right, I've got some page header information and then something with some a lot of redundancy in this data, right? With page compression, SQL Server finds the redundant strings, such as I have the 4 A's followed by 2 C's here, 3 A's followed by 3 C's. It looks for whatever portions it can find that are redundant, moves them out, and instead points to them, takes that prefix out, and instead points to that so that it's not repeated over and over and over again throughout your data. Once again, the benefit of that, when you're dealing with a lot of data, right? I've dealt with some banking clients that may have billions of rows for customer information. Once again, the analogy I gave before, dealing with U.S. government entities may have millions and millions of rows of information. If it's text, you will oftentimes find a lot of redundant information. So going back to our particular client, what we're working on, our database for our product isn't huge, right? We're dealing with, what, 400 or 500 different variations of our product type. All of them do start with the same, 8 characters just about, Veronica, and then the type of Veronica. So in our case, it may not be beneficial to go through the hassle of pulling that out, but as our customer base grows, on the other hand, we may find, because we'll probably have a lot more than 400 if things are going well, we'll find that we start to see some redundancy in our customers. So we could use possibly some page level compression. One other thing I want to show you here in the library, let's go over to row compression implementation. There we go. And if we don't want the blog, I want to take you to the implementation. And none of those is giving me what I want. Here, let's go back. I think I have another path that can get me there. Do this, and right here I can get to row compression implementation. Let's just go there. And what I want to show you here is the data types that come into play. When you're dealing with row compression, remember you're dealing with moving from a fixed length data field to a variable length data field. You only allocate the space you need. You're not just blocking off, pieces of memory when you don't need them. But SQL Server can only implement this against certain data types. So for example, if I'm dealing with a tiny int data type, no benefit. If I'm dealing with a small int, however, there is a benefit. So you do want to consider what data types you're using if you think you're going to be using data compression, because you'll get a lot more bang for your buck if you're using a majority of the data types where compression is going to make a difference, right? So small int, big int, decimal, etc. So most of your other numeric types will give you some benefit. Getting into your date type, your small date type, no. Regular date type, date time, rather, yes. Date time, no. Okay? So you'll want to pay attention to that kind of thing when you're doing your database design, deciding how you want to lay out the data. Now, for system administrators, that may not be your decision. You may not even get to make a call on that, but it'll give you the information and the ammunition you need to determine if data compression is going to be a win for you. So let's jump back over to the slides. I have a few other points I want to make before we actually go in and do some compression. So we talked about row compression and page compression and some of the differences between them. Now let's get into what you can compress, what objects, and it's basically three. You can do compression against a table, you can compress indexes that are against tables, and you can do compression against partitions. My focus right now is data compression, but I do want to give you a little background on data partitions, so when we talk about compressing a partition, you have some idea what we're talking about. Data partitions give you a way to segregate your data into smaller components. You segregate it along arbitrary boundaries that you define using partition functions. And you can do cool things like convert a non-partitioned table to partitioned and vice versa. You can switch it back and forth. And then you can transfer data by adding or moving or removing partitions between these different partitions. So you have the flexibility to move things around inside of them. But once again, if you're dealing with partitions, you're typically dealing with massive amounts of data. And you need ways to make it more manageable, such as partitioning it into segments. So here, let's jump over to my server and just quickly look at the interface for creating partitions. So I'm on my SQL Server box. If I go to any particular table, I'll go to my customer table, right click, and if I go to storage, there's a create partition option. So clicking there, I get my create partition wizard. Click next, and the first thing it'll ask me is, what column do I want to use to partition my data? So I can say I can partition for perhaps all the customers from certain states. So if I went to the state column, right, or partition along zip codes, or partition along names. So I have a choice of any, notice, one column. There's an option button here as opposed to a checkbox. So I'll go ahead and pick city. And then if I hit next, here's where I have to give it the actual function that I will use to partition the data. So if I selected city, right, I'll need to create some function that'll evaluate the city in each particular row and determine where that data should be placed. Now, once again, at this point, you're actually pulling in your programmers to start developing your functions to do that. And then once you have a list of pre-built functions, notice you have an option here to use an existing partition function. So once they're there, you can actually reassign them at your convenience. But we'll stop there and leave that for the designers to finish that process out. But I just wanted to give you that background on what a partition is. What our focus is right now, however, is how I go about compressing data. So let's jump back over to the slides. Now let's jump into actually doing this. SQL Server, like most Microsoft products, will give you a few different ways to get the job done. T-SQL versus using the GUI. going to show you the T-SQL first. Looking at row compression, create table, you give it a table name, give it some columns, some generic column names here, C1, which is int, C2, which is invarchar. And then the key thing is the with data compression down here equals row versus with data compression equals page. That's what you need to do as a person creating a table. Now, if you're going to actually do it after the fact using the GUI, let's jump over there and see that. So I'll bring up my SQL Server interface again. Start, Management Studio. Just going in using Windows Authentication again. Expand, go to the database of interest, go to the table of interest, and here I can see all the tables in my Veronica database. And let's say my order detail table I want to compress. Right click, there's a storage option, and if I go to manage compression, clicking there gives me the data compression wizard. Give it a next, and I like this interface. Compression type, hit the drop down, there's my row versus my page. If I click on row and do a calculate, it's kind of cool. It'll tell me how much space before and after. Way cool. So I went from 0.117 megabytes down to 0.086. So pretty significant savings even on a small database such as this. And I can go back and recalculate that for page compression instead. Right? So instead of 0.086, I get 0.055. So with the page compression in this case, I do even a little better. But once I pick the one I want, click next. I can tell it to create a script to run this later, run it immediately, schedule it at some future date. Go ahead and run it now. Click next again. I can get a summary if I need it. Click finish. And I have successfully compressed my order detail table. Compressing an index is really the same song and dance. If I go to the table itself, let's say I go to the customer table, expand that, and there's my indices. Expand that, I can see my one index that's already there, my customer index. Right click, get the same thing, storage, manage compression, same wizard. I can pick one, do a calculate. Tells me how much I save. Not a whole lot here, right? Which isn't surprising given the size of my database. There's not a whole lot in this database. And if I go with the page, once again, not a lot of savings. So you might want to ask yourself, gee, is it worth doing the compression in this case? Possibly not. All right? So I go ahead and cancel out of this. And now going back in one more time to that same interface by right-clicking on table name, going to storage again, and going to manage compression, brings me back to the wizard. And what I wanted to focus on this time a little differently is simply the partition number. We didn't mention that before. Notice I only have one partition in this case, my default partition. So when I'm selecting the compression type for the table, I'm picking the one and only partition that exists. And I could pick just like before. And I also have the option here of saying use same compression type for all partitions, so I could do it once here at the top for all the partitions. So in this case, once again, having one partition, selecting it here at the top, selecting row, or selecting them individually. Could be done. Okay, so with that, we've seen all three types of objects that I can compress. So let's jump back over to our slide to continue on. Looking at compressing your backups. First of all, the question is, what's it going to cost me? Now, when we talk about compression, as we've seen before, you always pay a hit in performance. You know, you're getting a little bit of space back, but you definitely want to look at what am I going to benefit? Is it going to be worth the compression? In many cases, you know, disk space is a lot cheaper than CPU time, but you want to look at it. You want to analyze it. Some of the tools you can use we've talked about before, and we'll dabble with them again in this module. But your Windows I/O performance counters, we talked about those in the other performance measures we did for SQL Server. You can use your SQL Server objects, your backup device objects, your database objects counter to see what's going on with your SQL Server database anytime you enable compression on your backups. And then another tool we talk about in another video is Resource Governor. You can use Resource Governor to kind of put a box around how much CPU time and as well as how much RAM is used by any particular process. So you can kind of put a wrapper around your backups to make sure they don't take over more than you need them to of your system's resources. But here's another thing you can do to get a feel for how much you're going to save with your compression. In your MSDB system database, there's the backup set table that has two key columns. It'll give you the size of your backup uncompressed and the size of your backup compressed. So using that, you can get a very quantitative feel for what you're gaining. So simply doing a select on those two fields, and you don't have to do this exact formula, but you could just simply do a simple ratio. You know, what percentage am I getting of savings there? And I just specifically said MSDB ... backup to tell it to go to that database. And some factors that will impact how much you save include what's your data type. Character data, for example, is going to give you a much better bang for your buck. So anytime you're dealing with primarily character data, you're likely to be more successful in getting the results you want out of your data compression. The consistency of the data among the rows on your page. You know, how much of it is just simply like we showed before. You know, if you've got a bazillion rows, so maybe not quite a bazillion, but you've got a lot of data. You know, I've had clients that literally have billions of rows of customer, client, or some type of other individual person data. We'll have things such as really common names, such as, you know, and depending on the populations that you're working with, the U.S. population, you get a billion rows, you're going to have a lot of guys named John, right? Well, is there a way to represent that fact that they all have the same name without repeating the same 4 characters? That type of thing can make a huge difference in your data compression. Encrypted data doesn't do quite as well when you're doing data compression. It's already done a lot of different things with it to encrypt it, so you get less bang for your buck on compressing that. And then if the database is already compressed, well, you know, you're probably really going overboard if you're going to try and compress the actual backups as well, because you're going to see very, very little impact from trying to compress a backup from a database that's already compressed. But here, let's actually run through seeing some of the results of doing it with and without backup compression turned on. So go and start, bring up SQL Server. I'm going to log in using whatever admin account I'm using right now. I'm currently logged in as administrator. And if I go to databases, there's my Veronica's database. I'm going to right click on that and go to properties. And once in there, the very top of that list on the general page, it says I have never backed up my database or my log, which means I'm being a bad system administrator, right? Well, this is only a sample database, so it doesn't really matter, but you should see something there. But I've not backed up this database at all yet. So if I were to run the query that we saw a second ago, let's see what happens. Just select, and I want the backup field, and for now I'll just put a comma in the compressed underscore backup size. Those two fields, enter. I want them from my MSDB database, and while it's doing a lookup, there's a little bit of a freeze until it figures out, gets the name of all the tables in that database. I can scroll down, press tab, press F5 to run that, and I get absolutely nothing because there's nothing in that table yet. I haven't backed anything up yet. So we know we're looking good so far. Let's change that. Right click on Veronica's, and if I go to tasks, go to backup, it's defaulting to full, defaulting to the same location I've been using, my default location. Click OK. 50, 70, 80, 90, 100%. Successful. Click OK. And I'm going to go right back and do my log file just because a good database administrator should. And there's my transaction log. Once again, click OK. That'll go really fast because there are no transactions against this database. And let's just throw one other one on there. I'll throw the master database on there because you should at least have one backup of that always. Once again, this is not a production database, but if you're in a production environment, you should at least at a minimum have all of that stuff done right away before you do anything else, right? So there, I've backed them up. I'm going to run this query again. Let's see what I get. Click there, press F5, and there's my backup sizes. Now I get my backup size and my compressed. My backup size here on the left-hand side and my compressed backup size here on the right-hand side, and they're showing to be the exact same size, which makes sense. I'm not running compression yet, right? So let's change that. If I go to the server name itself and right-click, go to Properties, go down to Database Settings, and there is a checkbox. I can click on that, compress backup, click OK. Right? And by the way, just one other thing to note, I could have told it to compress. Just kind of show that. Task, go to backup. If I go to the options here, use the default server setting, which was not to compress, or I could have specifically said compress it here as well. Okay? But, cancel out of here. Execute another backup. Right click, task. Just do a full right click. 7800. Looks good. Do a log right quick. Once again, backups don't ever go this fast in real life, right? Because they have a lot more data. This is a pretty small database, but it gets us through the backup process fast enough where we can see the results. Run this again. I get the same numbers. Nothing changed. What happened? It basically ignored my request to compress the database because you cannot have compressed and uncompressed on the same volume. Now, you don't even get an error message, unfortunately, which is kind of unfortunate. But here, if I go to Tasks, I can kind of force an error message for you. If I go back up, go to Options, and if I specifically tell it here, compress the backup, which, like I really mean it, back it up, click OK, and this time I get an error message, and it explains basically what I just said. The backup cannot be performed because compression was requested after the media was formatted with an incompatible structure. Basically, the incompatible structure is you did it first uncompressed, and you're trying to write to the same media, the same file, and now have it compressed. It won't let you do that. So you have to do it to a whole new file. All right? So I'll OK out of that. Go back here to my general, and we want to switch from writing to this file here to a new one. So I'm going to go add. It gives me the path, which is good, so I can put it in the same spot. And I'll just call it Veronica_comp.bak. Right? Click OK. So I've given it a new destination, but it's defaulting to the first. I'm going to remove that one completely. So there, now it's going to default to that and that only. Right? Doing OK now. I get successful again. Click OK. Rerun the statement. And notice my backup size has now shrunk significantly. Oh, looks like better than half. Yeah, it went down by better than half. Now, in my case, my database is relatively small. I think we have, 8,000 or so customers in here, 30,000, something like that. It's really a small database. But as you can see, the percentage saved, close to 50%, can be huge, especially when you're dealing primarily with text. Now, the cost is something you'll have to look at again. Does it make sense to compress my backups given what I'm going to save, how much it costs to buy more hard drive space versus a faster CPU? So those are the things you're going to want to weigh before saying, hey, compress it, save the space. Well, maybe, maybe not. Okay? So with that leads us through the process of doing the backups. Now, one other thing I do want to add on here, I'm not going to redo what we did in another video, but in another video I walked through performance monitoring in SQL Server and showed you how to do the various performance tasks to track how SQL Server is performing. You can use those tools to determine the impact of a compressed backup on your system. So that'll be something else you could potentially use, or you might just look at how much slower, how much longer is it taking to do my backup. Sometimes you just look at the window, and if it's not going to work in that window, that lets you know, hey, I can't compress based on the amount of time and the amount of data I have to back up. So with that, let's jump back to our slides and wrap things up. So what did we cover? We looked at compressing SQL Server data. Now, when you're compressing SQL Server data, you're really talking about compressing specific objects, and we looked at 3. We looked at compressing tables, compressing indices, and compressing partitions. We talked about the compression types, basically two main types. We have the row compression versus the page compression, and then we also looked at compressing our database backups. Some terms. There weren't a whole lot of new terms in this video, but we did talk about page compression, which looks for data redundancy and tries to eliminate the redundancy throughout the data, versus row compression, which looks for unused space within a row and basically moves that from a fixed to a variable length structure so that you're not wasting space when it's not needed. And as a result of watching this video, you should know how to, one, compress your SQL Server backups, and saw some of the pros and cons and ins and outs of that, and compressing your SQL Server objects, and we looked at three: compressing tables, you should be able to compress an index, and compress a partition. So with that, we come to the end of this video. Thanks for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.